this podcast, John Knives talks about demystifying AI for enterprises. So, stay tuned. So, welcome everyone to another episode of Future of Data podcast. Today, we have with us an amazing guest, John Louis Knives. Serves as Chief Data Officer and the Global Chair of the Digital Transformation Practice at N2 Growth. Prior to joining N2 Growth, Mr. Knives was at IBM Global Business Services within the Watson and Analytics Center of Competence. There he worked on cognitive digital transformation project related to Watson, big data, analytical, social business, and marketing advertising technologies. Example include cognitive TV and the application of external unstructured data, social weather for business transformations. Prior relevant experience includes executive leadership positions at Nielsen, IRI, Kraft, two successful advertising technology acquisitions, AppNexus, and Syntech Media. In this capacity, John combines information analytics and technology to create significant business value in transformative ways. John earned a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from University of Buffalo and an MBA in finance and computer science from Pace. He is married with 4 kids and lives in New York City area. With that said, John, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, merci. So it's Jean-Louis, but I go by John. And, thanks very much. That was a great introduction.
Awesome. So why don't you walk us through your arc of your career? Like what you have been through a lot. And I think to give you a background, when I was looking at your profile, the thing that fascinated me was AI. Like you have been from the marketing analytics to really hardcore vendors who are delivering product services in AI and Watson and all.
Yeah.
If you can walk us through your journey.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you did a great job with my profile, so I'll try not to repeat that. But I started off as a data scientist. All right, engineer, MBA. I was a data scientist, Kraft Foods, Dow 30 company. Was doing regression models. Got a President's Award for a coffee commodity price forecasting model. Was doing simulation work, optimization work. So a true data scientist, right? Of that day, in a world where people were really software engineers. So it was unique to be a data scientist back then. I went to go work at a company that really fostered the first era of big data. So this was a company, Information Resources. They were pioneering UPC scanner data. And that suddenly was an order of magnitude. So all of a sudden, companies had exactly what product was purchased, what the price was, all of the promotional conditions, consumer promotions, advertising, and how do I take the quantum increase in terms of information and make sense of it? So I was really big data of its era. I helped them kind of build out their business intelligence practice, eventually becoming, sort of the EVP of sales and general manager of the software group. Where we eventually sold that to Oracle, and that became kind of Oracle's original, business intelligence kind of kernel. But that was really working with major companies, Pepsi, Procter. How do I take advantage of this data? How do we, early use of neural networks, of expert systems to help them be able to kind of do that? I was fortunate enough to join Nielsen when the next era of big data occurred, which was the commercialization of the internet. So we basically built a global internet measurement service, the first, and it really talked about what people did online, how they came to their site, where they went to the site, what the effects of advertising were, and, kind of on UK television, explaining the internet to people, showing that, the average person spent about 30 seconds a page, and, all of a sudden eBay was 30 minutes and sticky, and, so how do I monetize all of this data is what we were kind of talking about there. As you mentioned, looked at now advertising and advertising technology, which is amazing how much technology goes into the online ads that you end up seeing. And then, made my way to IBM when they, were first launching Watson. So Jeopardy had come out. It was a technology in search of a solution. So really helped at what some of the early use cases would look like. How do I, how do you take this natural language data, but how do you take external unstructured data? So worked with companies like Twitter at monetizing that type of information, and how do I combine sort of the marketing cloud that kind of IBM had. So it was really part of the early set of use cases that you mentioned, including things like what the future of television looks like, for example, right? And now I'm doing that on my own. I'm doing it as part of another company. I'm chief digital officer of this company, Into Growth, and we're basically building a practice that's trying to help companies take advantage of the transformational opportunity that this combination of data and analytics provides. And I also have the pleasure of teaching at Rutgers. So I'm teaching a class on, machine learning for executives. So it's really working with major corporations and helping them take advantage of this underlying big data and machine learning that's coming out there. So that's a little bit of the arc. It's always been kind of business building, and it's always been trying to help companies, take advantage of the data and the analytics and the emerging technologies in innovative ways.
Interesting. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Fascinating, by the way, and I do appreciate you for sharing that. So tell me more about your current role, and if you can walk us a bit more on what Into Growth is and what do you do and all that, and definitely your academics as well. So
we're a leadership advisory company. Forbes recognizes Into Growth as one of the top management consulting firms. It also has a very strong executive search practice. All right, so those are the two parts of it, and I'm building out an AI or cognitive transformation practice on their behalf. So to do that, we've developed a series of tools. So I've created this, what I call the I6 framework, which are 6 I's that we work with companies to help them identify where the opportunities are. So the 6 I's are focused on the individual, on information, on innovation, on incubation, and on investment. So kind of 6 I's. So focus on the individual is really kind of personalization, consumer, customer centricity that every company needs to have in order to drive digital transformation. That's first and foremost. Then you look at it, what information is needed. You don't start with the information, you start with the customer need, but then you figure out what the information is, what the 4 V's are, big data that you want to be able to then have that solves the problem. Innovation. We help create a roadmap, an AI roadmap of a portfolio of AI opportunities that exist, and then you prioritize them. And then what we can do is we could incubate those opportunities. So, in one example, we ended up building a cognitive digital agent for a client that had a need to improve their customer intimacy. I'll tell a little bit more about that later. And then investment. You create the business case, the ROI case around going ahead and doing that. That's tied, not as science projects, but tied to business outcomes. All right, so we follow this 6 I framework. We typically then do an assessment that includes those 6 I's, and then very often try to tie it to one of these proof of concept quick wins, so that it's not just sort of theoretical, but clients are able to see these kind of AI in action in a very short amount of time. All right, so that's kind of an example of what we're doing here. And then we're also teaching at Rutgers, and that really opens up a whole slew of opportunities. So this is not necessarily the students, this is corporations that send teams of people that we then work with at trying to identify some big data and transformative opportunities that they have.
Interesting. And if you can walk us through what really does Chief Digital Officer means here for a company like Into Growth?
Yeah, so it really is about thinking of your business differently. So if you're an executive search firm, which is often about personalities, and we're really looking at the application of artificial intelligence to help differentiate that kind of a practice. We could try to determine not just what a candidate. So I think of it not as big data, but as wide data. So if you want to think about an HR application, I've got rows of people that I've got, and I've got some attributes about them, but I can add significant number of wide columns about them. I can take their resume and figure out from that. Now I can codify it to what some characteristics look like. I can infer from people's Twitter profiles various elements. I can infer from various writings that they've done various elements. And so I can create this broader holistic picture of a candidate or employees and use that as better inputs to try to, align skills to requirements. It's just an example of a digital application within the context of an internal application, right? And the second part is really as global chair of this AI transformation practice to build out that practice with clients.
Interesting, fascinating. So I definitely want your perspective on the current trend of AI, right? So we hear, so I think it used to be big data a couple of years back. Now all we hear about is AI, machine learning, AI. What do you think? Is this a real thing, or it's overhyped? Like, what's your perspective on that?
Hey, I always think there's good news and bad news, right? So the bad news is that, generally speaking, AI can only do two things. Think of it as broadly, but when you break it down, it does two things. It clusters data. It takes data and explores it and clusters it and segments it to come up with new observations. And it makes predictions. So it predicts what's going to happen. That's the bad news. It only does two things. The good news is that by doing those two things, you could unlock untold amount of value creation within your organizations by kind of doing those two things better. And so what I try to do is narrow the way people think about these things to focus them on a couple of things that they can then visualize and see and try to make improvements on. Things like clustering and things like predictions. I think the New York Times said it best, which is, let me just read their quote. AI can probably do less right now than you think, but it will eventually do more than you probably think, in more places than you probably think, and it will probably evolve faster than the most powerful technologies have in the past. All right, and so it really will make its way, in many cases, transparently by simply automating things that are done, augmenting our capabilities to do things, or doing things a little bit more autonomously for us. So those are three different ways of thinking about AI: is automated intelligence, augmented intelligence, and then autonomous intelligence.
Interesting.
And I'll explain more on those.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. So from your perspective, is there an element of hype, or it's just everything what we are seeing is justified and more to come?
I think the hype machine is in great, there's a lot of hype out there around the technology. And the technology, I think, in many ways is not a thing that you're going to buy. It's going to improve a lot of the elements that you're doing in many ways more transparently. And, one of the ways to think about it might be, if I could jump ahead, might be to even look at some of the use cases that are every day, right? So, we see it in character recognition, as an example. So just to try to elaborate a bit. So it used to be people would, for 20 years, try to do if then else statements to figure out what an A is or a B and a C. And they couldn't quite figure out how to do it. The way they solved the problem was basically to bring the data and let a machine start reading many versions of A's or B's and try to do character recognition in that fashion. And the machine learned what an A versus a D is. And so now the post office, nobody looks at a letter anymore. All of those letters go through character recognition applications and done much more efficiently. So, it's an application of that you don't really see. Email. We used to get spam email all the time. Now you very rarely get spam email at this point in time. So artificial intelligence applications have been used to predict, is this spam or not spam? And over time learned which ones it was. And now you end up with great, content or the correct elements. Content is the same way. It looks for content that's relevant to you and sends you more relevant content, sends you more relevant advertising. Language translation. If you cut and paste from one to the other, it'll translate words now effortlessly. So there are a lot of applications that you end up seeing transparently now that use AI in the background to make you more efficient, to automate some of the things that used to take time, to augment your decision making. And some of the things just kind of go away. They get done automatically, like, serving of ads, for example. So there are a couple of those types of use cases that we see.
Interesting. And so I want your perspective on why now, like what has happened, or what are some of the drivers that are in action nowadays that we are hearing this word more often than we used to. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's three or four things, but it's the explosion of data. So you can draw any curve you want, geometric explosion of data. The rate of increase of data scientists or engineers is nowhere near what the rate of increase of data is. So the only way you're going to be able to take advantage of the data is through these types of applications. So data explosion is a major part of it. Another part of that's driving the data explosion is this notion of structured and unstructured data. Computers used to be good at numbers, structured data. Now suddenly it's able to translate images and make an image structured data from unstructured to structured. Now a computer can handle that. It takes text and turns text into numbers. A computer can handle that. It takes voice, turns that into numbers. It takes location information, translates weather data. So there's just this increase in terms of what I call wide data again, associated with that. Every individual generates about a gigabyte of digital exhaust every day that's being created into the ether. And so it's now capturing that. So it's the explosion of kind of data, compute power, network power, cloud power is much, much cheaper. Algorithms have improved. So Geoffrey Hinton has made, who head of Google, University of Toronto, tremendous improvements in terms of deep learning and neural networks and artificial neural networks. All of a sudden, image recognition. Yann LeCun out of Facebook and my hometown in France basically have made tremendous improvements in the algorithm. So data, compute, algorithm combined with businesses' time compression. So I need to make decisions quicker, more automated, faster. And that's driving kind of the explosion that we're now seeing out there.
Interesting. And one sort of keyword that we are hearing now a lot nowadays is deep learning. What's your perspective and take on, or what is deep learning? And then if you can shed some light for our viewers.
Yeah, so I try to help people, I try to demystify this whole thing of AI, right? AI, machine learning, deep learning. How do they fit? What are they? So I think the easiest way to think of it is kind of in a historical time series context. So AI came out first. It was the first word that was used. People like McCarthy at Dartmouth, MIT kind of coined the term in the 50s, imitation game was kind of part of that. And so AI came out first with this broader notion of anything that, makes computers smarter. Machine learning came out a little bit later, And that was these analytical techniques that had the concept change from if then else programming. So you're now programming on data to I just read all of the data and I allow the machine to learn itself. So Minsky out of MIT and IBM, for example, rather than teaching the program chess and trying to learn all the future moves, or checkers in his case, basically taught a computer how to play against itself and had trained itself. So it started off with random moves and it got smarter and smarter over time until now it's trained as the best chess player. So the machine learned how to play checkers, learned how to play chess, learned how to play Go. Machine learned these kind of capabilities. So that's the concept of machine learning that then gets applied. And now what we're seeing is this excitement in deep learning. And this deep learning comes out of Hinton and artificial neural networks and LeCun and convolutional neural networks. But now all of a sudden I can take, and they get their inspiration from, what organism out there learns. And if I'm going to build a thinking machine, where does that come from? And the inspiration comes from humans and the human brain and neurons. And we have 100 billion neurons. And how do they work? Well, they take inputs. If they reach a certain threshold, it sends a signal out. And so that concept of neurons and neural networks kind of evolved out of that kind of element, and huge improvements from backpropagation. And so basically neural networks learn how people operate, or basically learn how to improve via simulations an outcome. And it's basically a series of inputs that leads to an output, and the machine in the middle is doing almost all of the learning itself, is really kind of the concept there. And, one example would be, you could take an expert, a used car person, and they're an expert, and you can bring a car and he'll know the price of the car instantly. Now, if you try to train a computer to say, if it's a BMW or if it's a Dodge and if it's this year and this many miles, you can do that, but they're always changing. And so the system kind of learns what the pricing looks like, and it can spit out the prices as good as that expert can without the training, without having, so it creates leverage for organizations in order to do that.
Interesting.
So it's a little bit of the concept, and I did miss an important element. So one of the important elements, again, was this unstructured data, which is it's now taken pictures, visual data, and transform that into numerical information that kind of an artificial neural network can now use. That's convolutional neural networks. And so the whole application of vision data, of tagging photos, of using spoken word, of text, are now data sources that can now be applied, as well as sort of numerical data, right? So that's kind of a big breakthrough.
Interesting. And I think so. You briefly talked about some of the innovative ways or some of the use cases where we are seeing sort of AI and machine learning making an impact. What are some of the enterprise use cases that you are seeing where AI is disrupting and making changes? If you can walk us through those.
Right.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
So therein lies the opportunity. The early use cases I suggested there were kind of the born digital companies, the space companies that really now embedded AI at their core. So the opportunity is now, how can enterprise clients find those opportunities so that they can, further differentiate themselves? And some of the drivers are, the availability of rich data, unstructured types of information, so packaged goods, retail, media, advertising, entertainment, telco, finance, investment, healthcare, business services, government, defense. All of those companies that industries and sectors tend to be data rich, lend themselves very well and will become these kind of early adopters. And what we're seeing is that it really spans across all of the functions. Marketing can be benefited, finance benefits, HR benefits, operation has, benefits. And the way to think of it again is, how do I either automate an existing practice? How do I augment my decision making? Or even I can do kind of autonomous things. So, I cited a case study that we did early on, which was these kind of digital agents. So in many ways, these AI-powered chatbots, I think, will become the front end of artificial intelligence applications. They will understand natural language processing. They will try to mimic short-term user intents. And then if you reach a question that you didn't previously anticipate, it will go against a large data set, website information, product manual information, and really help provide that kind of insight. So, for example, in a government agency, they wanted to go ahead and improve what a user's ability to access land development codes. Have you ever looked at a government website about land development? It's impossible for a citizen to use. So now I can create a digital agent to guide them through their intents and or find the part of the website that's most relevant. All right. The library, we met with the Library of Congress. They're trying to unlock, their task is to preserve and protect the history of the country. It's like Indiana Jones, walls of, rooms of data. How do I monetize that? How do I read that, make that unstructured data? Those are the types of problems that some people are trying to use. All right. Marketing, huge across all the 4 P's of marketing. Pricing is a huge one. How do I forecast price? How do I forecast sales? How do I forecast costs? All of those things can be done. Segmentation, people who bought this, bought that. You can now, convenience stores looked at segments of people who bought this and that, and all of a sudden saw, hey, people who bought diapers also buy beer. It wasn't intuitive. It turns out that, when they look further, guys on the way home from the store got the call to buy diapers and, bought beers as well. So you find these unanticipated clusters of purchasing behavior by looking at this kind of information. All this sentiment analysis is something somebody's saying positive or negative. And how does that impact my brand or my future purchasing or the content that I want to see or the way I want to vote? So there are a lot of kind of applications around that type of information. Personalization, the ability to send the right message at the right time to the person who kind of wants it becomes improved. Personalization becomes the 4th P of kind of marketing. All right. What the next best offer, the next best action is that maximizes that user's intent of what they want to see. Healthcare, huge applications, image processing, prediction, government, defense, huge application. Defense, major investor in terms of AI types of technology. So it really spans across a whole host of client and enterprise application uses.
Interesting. And thank you for walking us through that. So I want to understand from you, what are some of the attributes of a successful AI project, right? So you had a good experience in a lot of companies, and sort of how have you measured a successful AI deployment or AI project? If you can walk us through that.
Yeah, so I think of that in kind of 2 ways. There's the success of the project, and then there's the organization's success. Successful project, it does start with good data, right? It starts with, garbage in, garbage out. So the ability to have a data-rich environment, again, I think of it big data, but I think of it as wide data. So if you're a retailer, you only have typically so many customers. I can add more richness to that customer set. Machine learning lends itself very well to then analyzing that data to determine predictive nature or clustering nature of that information. I can also add to my rows by getting more customers. And I think of those as kind of 2 different ways of thinking about the project. But good data, where I've seen projects fail is where they devolve into science experiments. So there is no one AI algorithm. There's a series of techniques that can be applied. And I've seen projects at times end up in terms of, is this a Boltzmann machine or is this, a Bayes algorithmic approach? And so at the prototyping, at the proof of concept phase, it's important to get data, get a minimum viable product quickly that's tied to business value so that I've got a quick success. It may not have everything, but it'll be in that class of minimum viable product that I could then go ahead and drive into a second phase that leads to an implementation phase. But this whole notion of 2 years, it has to be an agile kind of process to get to that kind of phase pretty quickly tied to business outcomes. The organizational part is almost as challenging, which is how do I create a culture of innovation? There are a lot of reasons why established organizations, are resistant to change or, they broke in. How do I incur that expense in order to sort of, cannibalize myself for the future, if you will, is always a tough business decision. So it takes a kind of a strategy of innovation coupled with the art of the possible. So a lot of internal organizations aren't aware of what the art of the possible is. I like to think of it as the Henry Ford example. They asked Henry Ford, did you ask consumers what they wanted? And he goes, I did, and they told me they wanted faster horses, right? So people don't know what they don't know. And so you need to kind of couple their business expertise with this art of the possible in order to now generate kind of a portfolio of new thinking in order to kind of drive that forward. And then you need to, align the organization, needs to be aligned in order to create this culture of trial, this culture of error out there. If you want to run fast prototypes and be agile, they're not all going to work. You can't penalize those people that have now taken that risk. And so you have to create that as kind of a culture within the organization.
Interesting. So if I'm a business and I want to figure out the next opportunity, like where can I find some of the potential use cases that I could work on in business context in AI and machine learning?
Yeah, so the way we've typically operated with customers, and I think the way it gets done, so some companies say, hey, look, I've got to get some AI stuff, so I hire a couple of kids and I start doing it. I actually think that they could get some value out of that, but it really needs to start from a kind of a top-down approach, which is, I really need to start with leadership getting behind a strategy of innovation. You end up doing a workshop that you end up identifying a portfolio of opportunities that exist out there. We typically think you need to kind of bring in outside help who can help with this kind of art of the possible way of thinking. Now I kind of create a couple of proof of concepts out there. I actually think proof of concepts that focus on external data outside of the firewall, they go quicker. You control, I can access Twitter data. I can access a lot of social data pretty quickly in order to kind of generate what some of these kind of use cases look like. And at the same time, then the organization then starts, creating kind of the competency in order to do that. And we often advocate that the clients create a competency center to get started on this, that they do get this outside help with the art of the possible, that they really focus on creating engaging customer experiences is really the place to start. You prototype quick wins, you confirm that you've got kind of the right data, you do it in an agile fashion. So you start off by doing an assessment that lays out this AI roadmap. Typically, it could include some prototyping work, and that's the way companies can get started pretty quickly.
Interesting. And how to get started? So sure, I have figured out some of the use cases, and what are some of the innovative ways I can how should companies should think about, and how should they get started? If you can walk us through that.
So I'll try to amplify a little clearer, perhaps. So it does typically start with kind of an assessment project, and there are a lot of ways to do it, but we follow that I6 framework that I laid out earlier, which starts off with, kind of the individual. So how do I create some customer experiences? What's the information that's kind of required to do that? We define a series of, and it's often about the customer journey, and it's about improving customer or consumer experiences. And then you identify a series of prototypes. All right, so maybe that's one half of the assessment. The other half of the assessment is to actually go ahead and do those kind of prototypes. Once you've got a prototype, then I think the organization can often start taking those prototypes to operationalize within their four walls, if you will, to turn those into operational applications. That's a great way of laying out what an AI strategy looks like. And you do so in the context of keeping track of, one great exercise is to say, companies are inhibited by their internal practices or internal data, the way they do, you often try to start with if I were to get into this business from scratch, how would I approach it? How is that startup thinking about improving the relationship with my customer better? And I really try to recreate what that customer experience should look like. And then I try to do that within my context of my environment. So I lay out a vision of where do you want to be in, 3 to 5 years. You figure out a baseline of where you are, where you are in the maturity curve. And then you do a gap analysis. What are the gaps for me to get to where I want to be? And then what are those projects that I need to do in order to close those gaps? And then how do I keep that tied to business outcomes? So there's a playbook that we tend to follow to help clients get to value quickly.
Interesting. And actually, so one of the things that we hear a lot from our vantage point is, if folks that are struggling to convince leadership of how to get started, right? So definitely and thank you so much for walking us through how to get started and how to plan these projects. But what about the challenges when it comes to convincing leaders of the value to get started in this? Do you have any insights on that?
So, there's carrot or stick. I tend to like to think of it from a carrot point of view of what the effectiveness opportunities are. So where the top line growth opportunities are, how I'm serving my customers better, how I'm being more efficient, how I'm driving costs out of the system through the application of these technologies. So those are kind of compelling sort of ROI business cases. The second business case and where we see there's huge risk is a lot of companies have a fast follower mindset. I'm simply going to keep track of what's going on and then move quickly.
Right.
And there are myriad of cases around how fast followers have failed to be able to react quickly enough, where a smaller company has created an app and nobody's really using it, and they improve it a little bit. Nobody's really using it. And they improve it a little bit more, and all of a sudden everyone rushes to that new approach, and they are far behind the ability now to respond effectively. So, I would just think fast follower is a losing strategy for an enterprise, and whether they are, creating the center of competence internally within the organization to do that, if they're complementing that with external resources in order to not have to make that much of a CapEx investment, they really need to be reimagining their customer relationship, their information architecture, and what the portfolio of potential projects are that can improve their either customer intimacy or their operational effectiveness.
Interesting. And what is the organizational implication of all this?
I do think it starts with creating a culture of innovation. So a culture where where risks are going to be encouraged and where we're going to allow experiments to occur and where occasionally failure is tolerated because of those risks that are occurring. I do think there's best to have this competency center, so you have a few resources that are knowledgeable and can connect the various dots. I think it does make sense to get outside help. I do think you want to kind of prototype these things, and that's kind of the culture of change that you want to be able to put in place, and this agile kind of process that they need to put in place.
Interesting. And what's the societal impact of this evolution?
Hey, so AI has a lot of advocates and some concerned folks out there. At this point, there are a couple of types of AI. There's applied AI, and that's frankly all we're talking about now. And then there's general AI or pure AI, which is this, omnipresent knowledge. To date, we can't see any of the major companies working on pure AI types of that and generalized AI. It's really all about applied AI. You give a computer a goal, and it will look at the data set and optimize itself to optimize that particular goal. I want to understand whether the stock market, whether some asset class is going to be higher or lower in 6 months or not. I take all the available data and try to figure that out. So it's kind of that goal optimization approach. A famous paper was written, Kuhn, on the structure of scientific revolution out there, and scientific revolutions go through 3 basic phases. And when the automotive engine, steam engine got created, the first thing they did was replace the horse. So I continued plowing the fields. Only now I'm plowing the fields with this kind of engine. Then I kind of realized, well, I can build roads and make these engines more efficient and expand my reach. And then over time, the suburbs got created. But transformation occurred in society as a result of that. But no one really was able to predict that the suburbs were going to come when the steam engine got created. But those are 3 stages. So you improve what you're currently doing. You do it better in an augmented sense. And then eventually you have transformation. So constructive destruction will occur. It's occurred many times over the past. It will likely occur again. Most people think that 25% of the work of a white-collar person can be automated. You don't have to go looking for things anymore. A lot of that stuff can simply, I don't have to schedule meetings. I don't have to spend my time on a bunch of administration things. Those can all be automated. Decisions that I make can be augmented. I can make smarter decisions. And then there are, a whole other class of robotics and autonomous elements out there as well. So I can do new things that really do not involve sort of human intervention, if you will. So there are a couple of classes out there, but I do think the organizational implication will eventually be, I think of narrower trees. So if an organization's a tree, the trees will get narrower, and I think you'll have a lot more trees in the forest.
Interesting.
And that's kind of my vision of what the kind of the future will look like.
Interesting. So let's talk briefly about your academia background. So you said that you are helping business leaders understand this idea of AI, and I'm curious to know, what is one thing that you are presently either surprised with, that executives get it wrong about AI? Do you have any insights on those?
So, it's still a general comment, right? But we've had companies that send 10 people to these classes, major corporations, major Fortune 500. You'll have a couple of VPs, some directors, a team that is systems engineers, a couple of data scientists. All right, they all have a different impression of what AI is and what the business cases are. What AI versus machine learning versus deep learning versus neural networks are. But I do think that one of the most beneficial things I have found is that by walking people through kind of understanding that and understanding how some of these capabilities work and trying to see that it really is a classification or segmentation element and that it's a predicting element. So all of a sudden, the end of the class has them building use cases, and they have pages of use cases coming out of the class where they didn't have any coming into the class, where they were struggling with. All of a sudden, procurement says, wow, I can really now forecast the risk of all the suppliers out there based on all of this external data. So I want to be able to, understand risk of my supply chain, if you will. And, finance ends up with a whole notion of, wow, now I can predict costs in a different way that I kind of thought of in the past. HR people now feel I can understand, if I want to hire a salesperson, I think maybe they want them to be extroverted versus introverted, but I really haven't tested that. And I can start, determining various attributes and start looking at personality profiles in innovative ways. So, you can go through the marketing person all of a sudden really looks at the ability to drive content and advertising and location and weather. And, now all of a sudden I can forecast sales. The packaged goods company that can now look at weather and events and and social trends. And, maybe that can help me predict how much more ice cream I'm going to sell by knowing what the weather's going to be and the fact that this concert happens to be there and, this flavor is trending. And, all of a sudden people start seeing new ways of improving what their kind of underlying functions look like by use of this application. Churn modeling. People who, large corporations value chain, banks and telecommunications companies and have entire organizations invested in understanding that, think, wow, if I can add these other columns, make my data wider, I might be able to do a better job of predicting an important element, such as what churn looks like and what, new customer acquisition elements look like. And suddenly I can think of life events. I can find out that someone is moving or they got a job or they got a raise or, their kid's going to college and, wow, all of a sudden that generates an awful lot of new information that I didn't have access to in the past. So people become enamored with what the art of the possible becomes and are able to, pretty quickly create a whole series of use cases that are unique to their situation, right?
Interesting.
And so that's, your original question was the satisfying part of the academia part is really by kind of helping people understand how these things work a little bit. They learn what they don't do as much as they learn what they do. So right now people think AI does everything. So you got to focus at that AI helps you with these things. And armed with that, they're able to really elaborate or articulate what the value of, things like classification and prediction can do to their business.
Interesting. So if I'm an executive and I don't have access to, say, your university, like how should I get started with understanding what the hell AI is and how should I do with it? What are some of your thoughts that I as a leader could do? Maybe like 2 or 3 next tangible steps to help me understand this landscape a bit better.
So, we've kind of talked about that in a couple of different ways, but yeah, you can hire some resources so you can start getting some skills. And there are different skills that AI requires. All of a sudden they require curators or cognitive architects, some jobs you didn't necessarily have before. But I do think a great way to do it is to drive workshops, innovation workshops. So you bring together internal resources, business resources. It's really business resources that are almost the most important to figure, and then you have someone to help, facilitate that kind of discussion. So, it really is kind of a little bit of here's what's possible. Now let's do some brainstorming processes or some major pain points. and you use that to identify a portfolio of potential elements that you could then, start determining which ones are more feasible, what the data requirement, the ROIs, what a, potential proof of concept would look like. And, you could then surface a series of those, and the 10, the 20 ideas become the top 5, and you choose to, work on 1 or 2 of them. I worked with one major telecommunications company that had so many proof of concepts that they wanted to execute and wanted to create that culture of innovation. And they didn't want everybody to kind of have to go through this approval process. So they actually set aside a fund for, this is a pretty substantial fund for proof of concepts. And, they facilitated the fact that at least that was budgeted for. So they still had a way of gauging it, but they had a proof of concept fund that they were then able to allow companies to do internal things or external things in order to drive that kind of innovation, to do some quick learning. And they did a lot of it externally because they wanted it done fast. They couldn't wait for the research to get built. It's just, so proof of concepts are frequently done at pace externally. And if they seem to resonate, now I can kind of, bring them into my, into my 2-tiered, IT architecture, if you will, my agile structure. And that's the way that's the way companies are approaching some of this.
Interesting. Now let's spend a few minutes on you. I think one of the things that I definitely want from your perspective on what are like 1 to 3 best practices that has really helped you be what you are. If you can shed some light on that.
Hey, look, in my career, I started off as a data scientist. I kind of concluded that my niche was better at taking these complex elements and matching them to customer pain points. But rather than doing the work, I enjoyed matching the capabilities, getting to know customers, building their trust, figuring out what their pain points are, and trying to simplify the technology to meet their pain points. So, I try to be at the intersection of business and technology. Others are pure technologists. Others are more kind of pure business guys. So my raison d'etre, where I've had the most fun, is staying up to date on all of these emerging technologies, being aware of the art of the possible, being tied to customer business needs, and helping them drive value. So, it's subject matter expertise and, data analytics, emerging technology, AI technologies, coupled with domain expertise within specific industry verticals, packaged goods, retail, financial services, healthcare, media and entertainment, and really bridging the gap in those 2 elements.
Interesting. And we're almost at the tail end of the interview. So one thing that we almost ask every of the speaker is about their favorite read that they want to share with our listener and viewers. Do you
say that again?
So we ask our guests about their favorite reads or favorite book that they have read that they want to share. Do you have one that you want to share?
So I'll indicate a class. So I am hooked on podcasts. I'm hooked on consuming as much media as possible. I'm a cyclist. I play a little golf. I try to turn every exercise opportunity into a podcast moment. All right. And I really become enamored with a lot of the university materials that are available out there. Coursera has some great stuff. Jeffrey Hinton has, his version of deep learning available on a Coursera class, as does Andrew Ng. Udemy has some great content around artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, all of those kind of elements that can be consumed. EDX has an awful lot of content that's out there with Rutgers. We're actually creating, online kind of learning capabilities as well. I've been taking a class in machine learning from MIT that's offered online, and from Caltech that's offered online. And you can just sit there and take all of those things.
Interesting.
So, that is some of the stuff. And as far as podcast books, I'm getting ready to tackle War and Peace. I'm not quite sure I can handle 30 hours of it. That's just a big, long putt. But it is at the intersection of kind of historical context during the Napoleonic Wars, and one of the true classics of all time writers. And so I'm really tempted to play a couple of rounds of golf and listen to, War and Peace. That's my next read, my next listen.
Interesting, awesome. And do you have any podcasts that you like? You want to recommend?
Well, I did go through, a few of them, right? So I want to use this as an opportunity to thank you, right? So I've spent a lot of time looking for AI, applied AI related podcasts. And I personally have a hard time finding material in that niche. They're either very technical around, Python techniques, or they're very general around, what the future of engagement of customers might look like. And none of them are at that kind of intersection. That's why I jumped at the opportunity to be part of yours. I may create one, I may partner with you, but I think there is really that kind of area of the application of business and technology are there aren't any good ones out there. All right. So I do try to listen to the Forresters and the Gartners of the world. Harvard, what's it called? Harvard Business Review or Harvard Cast has one that's out there. There's an economics one that's really good, that really digs into a lot of this is about economic theory, right? And how it gets applied in innovative ways. So those are some of the, kind of my go-to kinds of podcasts, as well as,
interesting.
I really view the computer as a supercomputer in your pocket. And, I'm enthralled by everything that's available to learn out there. So I'm a little bit less social media, more content consumption.
Nice. I think that's great recommendations, and definitely shamelessly plugging this podcast as well. So now let's and by the way, John, thank you so much for being really candid and walking us through some of the interesting insights on the world of AI and machine learning. Before we part ways, I definitely want your closing remark for our listeners and our viewers. Do you have any parting thoughts for those folks?
I happen to think that better decisions lead to better outcomes, and that AI will allow all of us to make better decisions, at least better informed decisions, more informed decisions maybe, and it'll allow organizations to make more informed decisions, and it'll allow society to make more informed decisions. And so I take the glass half full approach. And I do think that for enterprise out there in particular, that there is we're moving from the early adopters, which tended to be those big Fortune 500. So at IBM, we'd show up to these big companies. They'd say, "Give us a couple of $1 million," and we'd go off and do a science experiment for the early adopters. They could afford it. They really wanted to, make sure they're not left behind in technology. Most other companies, run a little bit of a tighter ship. And, we are entering into the early majority phase out there where, speech recognition has reached a point that's pretty good. Visual recognition has reached a point that's pretty good. Here, I'll leave any listeners that are left. I will ask them to do this task. Go to Facebook from their phone or from their website, and look at send a message page on any company's website. Go to Pepsi, go to any company you want, and click send a message. And tell me what you get. In most cases, you get nothing. I have sat in front of most packaged goods companies, most retailers, most financial services. I want to create a better relationship with my customers. True. Is literally the first word out of any manager's mouth. I look at Facebook, Messenger, send me a message, and these companies are sound asleep. It's got to be less than 3% of companies that are actually engaging their customers in a channel where many of their customers are at and have I have never seen a bigger business opportunity than by going to Facebook and send a message to that company. And then if they don't have anything, contact that company and let's tell them we can fix that. We can help them engage with their customers better. So opportunities are abound, and I think there are tremendous ways of those companies that take advantage of the early adopter opportunities they have, as opposed to being the laggards. And those companies will benefit from the science experiments, from what's worked, what's not worked, and can benefit from that. And that little last pearl I gave you is a huge business opportunity.
So with that, thank you so much, John, for spending generous amount of time with our audience, walking us through all the cool insights. You're always welcome on the podcast. Love to have you back again in a couple of months, listening to your journey, and definitely whenever you're in Boston, love to meet over. We can go for a golf. Yes, we can do that. So thank you so much.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a